So nice to see this big turnout on this sweltering day. So kind of you all to come. I know that coming to campus when you're not normally here is a gift to all of us. And so really thrilled. We have such a wonderful turnout of undergrads, grads, faculty, staff, folks from across campus. We even have some folks from out of state. That's the draw of Andrew Bridge, everybody. Okay. So I'm super excited to have Andrew Bridge joining us today. Andrew's had quite an extraordinary life, which I'm sure he will give you some little bits and pieces of a story about. Placed in foster care around age 6 or 7 in Los Angeles County, which, as you all know, is the largest child welfare agency on the globe, at a time that was quite chaotic. Caseloads were enormous, and he got ensnared in the system that was quite challenging. He then went on and went to college at Wesleyan. He went to Harvard Law School. He became a young lawyer and worked on a class action lawsuit in Alabama. And that story is described in this amazing book, which I read over the weekend. And it made me think, it made me cry, it made me hopeful, it made me not so hopeful. It's a lovely book about his journey, which he will tell you a little bit more about in a few minutes. He has served in many different capacities in different states as Deputy Director of Child Welfare for Illinois, as Executive Director of the Alliance for Children's Rights in LA. He's run foster family agencies, he's worked with foundations, he's done many things in addition to being a best-selling author. I should mention his previous book, if you haven't read it, is called Hope's Boy, the most moving, beautiful memoir I've ever read. So I hope that you will pick that up sometime. One of the things that I was wondering about when I picked up this book was, Andrew, in your Hope's Boy book, you found the voice of a little 7-year-old boy, and you found the feelings of a 7-year-old boy and experience and the sights and the smells, and you wrote about it with a voice of a 7-year-old. And I thought, how's he going to beat that? How's he going to beat that? And he did. And so this is obviously an adult, but the book is a moving account of what it was like to try to transform a system. So I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about the book. And then I have a few questions I have for you just about the book to just sort of give us another bigger picture. And then we'll open it up for questions. And then at the end, if you like, we also have books on sale in the back. You want to pick one up, and we'll have all of you participate. Okay. So Andrew, why don't you tell us just a little bit about this moving, haunting, powerful book and what inspired it?
Well, first of all, I hope everyone can hear me, and if you can't, just tell me to raise my voice and I'll do my very best. I want to thank all of you for being here. It's really very special, and I want to thank Jill for inviting me. This is a very special place, this is a very special school, and all of you are a very special group of people. And so it is a real honor to sit here with you. Thank you. This book is about the very first case that I worked on.
Speak a little bit.
Yeah, this book. Okay, I'll stand up. This book is about the very first case that I worked on in child welfare. So I just graduated from Harvard Law School. At that point, the most time that I'd ever spent in a courtroom was actually in my own foster care hearings. So I grew up in foster care from 6 to 18. I was taken from my mom, who developed paranoid schizophrenia when I was started when I was about 5. So when she was 23, it was her and me. And by the time I was taken, we were living in a flea bag of a motel in North Hollywood, California. After I was taken, it was for those of you in child welfare who know, we would call this I guess the best word I know is what people would call, this would be a botch taking. This was not one that was planned. This was really the toughest of all takings, which is literally yanking a child from his mother's arms. And so that's what happened in the street with my mom. I was placed in a place called MacLaren Hall. MacLaren was infamous then, and it is infamous now. MacLaren was originally an abandoned polio hospital. It had been acquired to separate foster children from children in juvenile halls. That's a difficult thing for any pair of bureaucracies to do, and Los Angeles County didn't do it. And so what it became was a mix of very young foster children like myself with older adolescents from juvenile facilities, all staffed very thinly. And so it became a very violent and unpredictable mix. The reason why you might know MacLaren now is MacLaren closed in 2003. I argued it's open all the way through the time that I was in foster care, long enough for me to graduate from law school, long enough for me to start this lawsuit. And Los Angeles County finally closed it in 2003. So it kept it in operation roughly from 1964 to 2003, starting from the very beginning in 1965. Grand jury reports, they also shut it down. I argued to shut it down. Los Angeles County refused to do that. When it did shut it down in 2003, it shut it down because of a lawsuit. When California opened up the statute of limitations for sexual assault in 2022, 3,500 people who had been placed at MacLaren as children came forward as victims of having been sexually assaulted by a staff or child. I know the Board of Supervisors in LA County pretty well, and I can tell you they're a little nervous. They estimate that the settlement will likely be $1 billion, and they have no idea how to pay for this. So the irony is that my career in foster care actually began at a facility that was very much like the facility where I first started with foster care. The Eufaula Adolescent Center was run by the state of Alabama. It was very large. It was the largest facility in the state. Thousands of children went through Eufaula, and not all of them survived. I began there as a part of a class action lawsuit, a pretty famous class action lawsuit called Wyatt. We all ought to know Wyatt because Wyatt is the one that's the lawsuit that set the standards for all people who are in psychiatric hospitals. We don't have them anymore, thankfully. The developmental centers where folks with developmental disabilities are only housed. Nevertheless, Wyatt was, for example, the lawsuit that decided that a patient could not be lobotomized involuntarily, could not be drugged into a stupor for the convenience of staff. The patient had the right to communicate with their family. And in my case, my mom, who was in psychiatric facilities at the time Wyatt came down, my mom would have had the right to talk to me as a boy and would have known who I was as a foster care. It was a very, very bitterly fought lawsuit, and there were lots of reasons for it. The principal reason was jobs. Eufaula had been planted in the southeast corner of the state in Barber County. Now, if you think of Alabama, it's kind of there's a little rectangle. That part of the state, which is part of the Black Belt, which refers to the soil and the area of plantations that go all and kind of oppressed throughout the South. That part is now one of the poorest parts of the state. And so that facility was planted there by the Alabama legislature to create jobs, as were the majority of other psychiatric facilities scattered across the state. There were a total of 7, which was enormous for a state of that size. And that meant that Eufaula was not a place that Alabama was going to develop because it brought in a lot of money, a lot of jobs. And so what I can say about it is, on the one hand, it was challenging because it meant walking into that facility. I was sent alone with a nonprofit, the Adolescent Center for Mental Health Law. It's a big nonprofit, but profits in a lot of things, so I went alone. And walking through those barbed wire fence gates was a little intimidating the first time. Meeting an orderly alone was intimidating for the first time. But also sitting with a kid meant that I could have conversations with that child. And I said, I would like to think that child felt more comfortable willing to share things. So just what I would say is that the story is about really, less about me, it's sort of what happened to me and Alabama, what Alabama, the first things that Alabama did to me personally, lying and filing contempt motions and that sort of thing about me. But also about two boys principally. One boy was David Dolahite. David was admitted to Eufaula because the state of Alabama would advertise to parents that this was a summer camp. So it's very similar to what you hear about with the troubled teen industry. It advertised to working families that if you had a kid, you were sneaking out, it was smoking, the kid you just were having a tough time with, made a promise. So they had promotional materials. They said, give us your kid, in 8 weeks, we'll give you another child. The problem with that was that families would volunteer to give their child to them. Normally, they'd run the route of insurance, church, going to schools, everything. Once they placed their child inside Eufaula, and they called and they said, I'd like to speak with my child, they got the same response. In this case, David Dolahite. The time the Dolahites called, they said, David's busy. David's in therapy. David's not here. David's on restriction. Right? When the family went to actually get their child back, right? They made a receptionist, go get your kid, go get him. Pack up their child, meet them in the park, go in the parking lot, I'm all packed up. And then quite literally, a sheriff's deputy would tap them on the shoulder. Sheriff's deputy had been sent by the state, and the deputy would be very clear. Say, while your child was here, your child got in an altercation with another child. Or we have a staff member who says that he hit him. Moreover, when you admitted your child, you said that your child took money from your purse. All of those are crimes. So what I'm going to do, the sheriff, is I'm going to give you a choice. You can take your child and put him back. You got him. Or I will arrest him and I will put him into juvenile justice. So this happened to hundreds and hundreds of children. In the case of David Dolahite, there was no mental therapy here. Seclusion was heavily relied on. Children were kept in basements. There was a set of on-site cells, which had been a former radar base. For every hour of therapy that David Dolahite received, he spent 33 hours in seclusion. David finally hanged. He survived. The hero, another hero of the boys, a boy, Wayne Tatum. Wayne stood about 4'2". He weighed 70 pounds. A little tiny kid, towhead, short hair. And that little boy stood up against the state of Alabama. And when I brought him into court, I don't know if anyone been in a Southern courtroom? Been to a Southern courtroom? Southern courtrooms, I have a better question. Anyone ever seen To Kill a Mockingbird? Right? That set is actually based on the actual courtroom that Harper Lee remembered from her childhood in Monroe County. Southern courtrooms are beautiful. They're absolutely gorgeous. And what happens in them is an entirely different matter, but they are beautiful. And so to prepare Wayne, I took him and I put him in this grand courthouse. It's now named the Frank Johnson Courthouse, after the man who desegregated Alabama. And it was in this very courtroom where Luther King appeared, where Rosa Parks appeared, where John Lewis appeared, where Washington Selma was allowed to go forward. And I put this little boy, and this is the first time that I'd ever had a witness, put him in this oak witness box, and you could barely see the top of his head, just barely. Now we're looking at him and saying, the one thing you cannot do is you cannot lie to me. And the reason why is I knew that the moment he lied, I would not be able to protect him. Wayne sat on that witness stand through the suicide of his mom, through the loss of his grandfather. And Wayne stood up against the state of Alabama. The Attorney General of Alabama felt it necessary to cross-examine that 70-pound witness for another 2 hours. The final ruling, and these rulings are really very rare because they don't reach federal court. They certainly don't reach federal court in the troubled teen industry because they're settled out. The final ruling discovered the rule you follow is basically, not as basically, as a children's penal.
Sorry.
A children's penal. So, and I do want to say that these practices of over-seclusion, over-medication, of excessive restraints, of the misuse of restraints, are practices that remain widespread in child welfare. and outside of this room. So, thank you. Yeah,
So speak up a little bit more.
okay,
Okay, we're trying to be a little bit louder.
okay, I'll use it.
I will put a little microphone
There we
on.
go.
So, that's a synopsis of this beautiful book and your efforts to transform this children's institution. Let's talk a little bit about Wayne, this little boy who you were just mentioning, because this story is sort of a story of one. It's a story about one little boy who decides to be brave. One little boy who experienced miserable, awful treatment, and you helped to support him to feel brave and to speak the truth, his truth. So I'm thinking about all of the people who are in this room, particularly students, who want to be brave, who want to be change makers, who see child welfare systems as riddled with errors and problems that need to be better. Can you just tell us a little bit more? Why does you convey that the power of one is pretty powerful? So do they have power?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is with Wayne, Wayne was a special kid in a lot of ways. He was funny and quippy, cute, all those sorts of things. But the other thing is, I think what was important was simply giving Wayne an opportunity to be listened to. And so I think the biggest thing that I learned, part of me knew this from being a child myself, was knowing how to just sit and listen. I just say one of my least favorite things when I see a child being examined or cross-examined, when I see a youth panel being interviewed, is to see a lawyer or a moderator have a child answer a question and then watch that lawyer or that moderator restate their answer. It's one of the most frustrating things that I can imagine. And so it's a matter of respecting their words, and in some ways that involves what I would say is a kind curiosity. I also say the other thing that's important, was important to me as a lawyer and a social worker actually taught me. There are two things that a social worker taught me. The first thing to do first. One was in talking to a child, sitting down with them. I remember as a boy having social workers come, and every single time I had to recount what over and over again. I talk about this. By the time I was in fifth grade, that answer just left me bored and irritated. It didn't mean anything anymore. But the social worker taught me the most important thing is to respect that child. And what that means is, after you've gone ahead and you open them up and they've given you so much, is to not forget to give them that moment of respect. Not to forget to remind them that they're loved. So that's the way that I've always approached kids, and I wish that the people who had worked with me as a boy had always done that. I have to say the other thing is a little off topic though, but it was so valuable to me, and it was valuable in determining the way the consent decree here worked. And I was in Chicago looking at the BH consent decree and the KDA consent decree. Is the thing that lawyers are not very good at, and that all of you are good at, is lawyers bring these lawsuits, and they're very good at identifying a point of law and a fact and going to a conclusion, finding a violation, finding a break. What they're not very good at is when you ask them, what do you want? What is your, and that's where you come. That's where you truly are valuable. And that is so important. Lawyers would be absolutely lost without that. And with that, I would say one of the most valuable things that a social worker did teach me was, in sitting with other lawyers, department people, judges, policy folks, is to take a moment to step back and just ask yourself, what does that look like? So if you're reviewing a child's case and you're talking about moving a child from one place, from a foster home, for example, to step back and say, what does that group home look like to that child? What does that change look like to that child? What do the change in rules look like to that child? What does the change in locations look like to that child? And when you begin to do that, you begin to realize that what we do so commonly in child welfare is we're very good at blaming the child, right? How many times we say, child failed their placement, right? Really? Child failed the placement? Child didn't pick the placement. Child decided whether it's close or far to the things or people the child loved. Child didn't decide the rules. No, we did that. And so I will say I'm not big on blaming. The way I would call it is the case planning thing. And we need to go back to that and answer. So
So I'm thinking about this book, and one of the interesting things that you did, besides describing what you did as a lawyer, what the circumstances were, was you wove in your previous experiences with foster care, your previous experiences with your mom and her living circumstances when she was no longer living independently. And you can feel the passion in this book. I mean, Andrew's very passionate about all these topics. You can just feel it come through. You can also see the knowledge, like that law degree gave you certain skills and qualifications and knowledge of the law that you were applying. One of the other things I see in this book is that you weave into it, just in a few places, politics and power. So you talk a little bit about Bill Clinton, you talk a little bit about Chief Justice John Roberts, you talk about Alabama and sort of why were they so invested in holding this place open that was so damaging to kids. So can you talk a little bit about power, politics, and change, and why those pieces are important for us all to know if we want to be change makers?
Yeah, so these are they're inseparable. I didn't learn that in law school. It certainly wasn't taught to me, right? But when you begin to practice, you learn how to separate. So, for example, to go back to MacLaren, the Board of Supervisors knew what was going on in MacLaren. MacLaren was investigated for the last time in 2003. They found incident reports that were 4 years old, an average of 6 incidents occurring every day, and were reviewed perfunctorily by staff investigating themselves. Board of Supervisors knew that. Board of Supervisors also knew that facility produced a lot of jobs. So what you run up against is it's not attractive, it's not what we like, but is you run against the politics of ambition and money. And so in this case, to bring John Roberts up, this lawsuit went through succession of presidencies and a succession of governors. Each governor going to Washington and asking each new presidential administration pull out the Department of Justice from the lawsuit, pull out the power of the federal government from the lawsuit, right? Because once you do that, the people we were leading the argument of the lawsuit, we were in charge of it, but we had the power of the federal government behind us. So people I used to work, we literally could have had the FBI, and the FBI did actually, in some instances, come into some of these facilities. That was an enormous power that we did not have as a nonprofit. And so what in this case happened is one of the governors of Alabama came to Washington, D.C. and met with a very young assistant attorney general, who happened to be the name of John Roberts. And Mr. Governor met with Mr. Roberts for an hour and a half and said that he wanted Alabama out. He wanted the federal government out of Alabama. And John Roberts agreed. And so under a memo that he sent to his boss, who was the attorney general, and also the assistant attorney general for civil rights, he asked that the federal government be removed from the mental case. And they didn't mention that governor had fulfilled his promises that he made to the kids at Eufaula.
He didn't mention that, in fact, there were government experts who'd gone back and down to Eufaula that year and found excessive seclusion of children, found children sodomizing each other in showers, found the use of fire extinguishers against children by staff. He didn't mention any of that. What he said was the lawsuit had become interminable. Interminable.
Too long.
Too long. And that word, that is not about justice. That is not about child welfare. That word is about politics. And he won. And so what happened was the federal government, chunk by chunk by chunk by chunk, rolled down their involvement in the state until it finally was left to small nonprofit and whatever donations you could get and whatever money you can get from the foundation. Now keep in mind who you're up against, right? And some of you, when you go off, you'll be experts and things like that. You're up against the state, right? And so when I was at the Alliance for Children's Rights, I did sue the county of Los Angeles a couple of times. And I used to joke that the advantage that a state government has is they're quite literally immortal. They don't die, right? Which means time means nothing to them. Time means nothing to us. That means nothing to them. And so that is their advantage. Time. It's not arguments. It's not facts. It's the ability to string it out. And so that's what Alabama did and was able to do. Alabama did actually rejoin the lawsuit. It rejoined the lawsuit late. And that was only after Bill Clinton decided that the state of Alabama really didn't matter anything to his presidential reelection. And so who cared? So he's going to go ahead and do that. And we'll add one other thing that the state of Alabama also did things like send letters to all of our experts. So imagine you're working as an expert. The governor, Gavin Newsom, gets a letter about you. It says you are violating the rights of a sister state. It's pretty intimidating. As a result, experts just fell off. So it is about that. It's about money. But you can make a difference. You can make a difference. Stand up and consider this. Won't win all the time. You want to win.
Let me open it up to you. Give questions. I have more questions, but I don't want to monopolize all of his time. Do any of you have questions about the book, about Andrew's career in reforming child welfare systems, his views about reforming child welfare systems, juvenile justice systems?
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Thank you for writing this book. It would be interesting to hear about your experience in reform, how you managed in different positions, high-level positions, working on reform. If you can share anything about that, that'd be great.
So I've done a few. I can talk about Illinois.
Thank you.
So I've done everything. I have. There's some consistencies. So from the very start of my career, for a whole number of reasons, I've always been very opposed to conflict. In my mind, it just isn't. Now, if you can create a model, you can tell me where you can go ahead and produce a facility where you can have community involvement, where children be kept safe, and all that you need to do to have a child lead somewhat of a normal life. Okay, I'll do it. I get to see. So, and what I would say also is the recognition that there are some things, and when you look at reforms, there are some things that you have to remember, as much as we would like to do them, they're simply not capable, they simply lie beyond the capacity of a bureaucracy to implement. Right? And so we need to keep that in mind. But in terms of reforms, so for example, in the area of mental health is the improvement of therapeutic foster homes. Done a lot. Therapeutic foster homes are a whole different sort of group of people, group of foster parents than traditional foster parents. I've done work around broadening sort of the elasticity of foster parent pools. So the way this works is, I ran a foster family agency. Everyone know what that is? Those are private agencies. They exist in the state of California. They don't exist in every state. Where private agencies actually recruit foster families and they oversee their cases. They act like many departments. one of the things that we learned, for example, and that I wish more would do is when you interview a foster parent, one of the first things that they'll tell you is the age of the kid. Yeah. You want to guess what the age is? What you're lucky at? You get to 7, you're lucky, right? Yeah, they want little kids. They want them little kids and babies. And in some ways, that's okay because half the kids in foster care, John and I were talking about this, half the kids in foster care are 0 to 6. So in some ways that fits. Otherwise, it doesn't. And so what we found was if you actually developed a relationship with your foster family, it's like the way we did, you might have a family that said, I wish departments would do this. A family that said, you know what, no older than 7. We found out if you went ahead and you called that family and you said, I know you said 7, but you know what? Let me tell you about Jimmy. Jimmy's 12. Just give me 3 minutes to talk about Jimmy. Right? That didn't work all the time. Probably a third, 40% of the time. You'd say, you know what? I'll take Jimmy. So you find that this shortage from a policy standpoint is in many ways false because this pool of foster parents is actually far more elastic than you think it is. And so what that means also is that these, for lack of a better word, these buckets of foster parents that we don't even touch because they said 6 to 7 are actually available to us. The other thing on a more broader policy level, I would say, and what I worked on in Illinois, is what happens with departments is they tend to calcify up. All right. So decision making tends to be taken from the bottom and flow upward. And so it becomes very difficult for frontline caseworkers, frontline social workers to go ahead and work directly with families and find tailored services to meet those families' needs. Even if they exist, it's very difficult to do that. And a lot of things that go into that, but a lot of that has to do with risk and with money, right? Keeping budgets intact and also looking at potential liability. And so one of the things we did in Illinois was this pushing down of decision making. So instead of requiring a regional director to go ahead and approve equine therapy, we pushed it down farther, as close, and the object was to get the service as the decision making regarding the service as close to the child as you possibly could. So those are. I will say the other thing that always, and this is the thing I think is one of, if not the one of the very most important, is narrowing the front gate. Right? If you ask any director of any major department, and they're willing to kind of put aside the politics, they will tell you we take in far too many children and we keep them too long because the front gate is simply too wide. Right? A part of that has to do with the way we define mandated reporters and the way mandated reporting works. And in that case, where I wrote a piece for the Washington Post, you cannot talk about foster care in this country without talking about race. You simply can't. Jill, for a country that has sent a person to the moon, developed a vaccine in 2 years, we still haven't figured out how to talk. We just can't do it in a way that's we should. The truth is, though, that if you're a Black child in this country, by the time you reach 18, you have a 50% chance of having gone through an investigation. Imagine knock on the door, you're separated from your parents, doors are searched, refrigerators are looked through, parents are questioned, children not advised. Advised of, they say will be used against them, they say will be used against them. You are investigated, you were spoken to without your parents there, neighbors are asked, right? All that happens to half of all Black children. It's inexcusable. The other thing I would say is that there are some very practical things that we can do about narrowing that front gate. One's very simple. It's called respecting the Constitution. It's very simple. It's really not complicated. It's so simple it infuriates me. I hate to break the news, but there is no social worker exception to the Fourth Amendment. No, with the Fourth Amendment, that's the one that says, right, illegal search and seizure, right? Your home is your castle, or whatever it's supposed to be, right? That the governments can't simply barge its way into your house, your apartment, wherever you're living, barge its way into your life. And the truth is, overwhelmingly, public departments do not respect that. You're required under the Fourth Amendment to obtain a warrant unless the child is in imminent harm. In New York City, ACS, the percentage of times that ACS actually bothers to go and get that warrant as constitutionally required is 0.2% of the time. So I want you just to think about this. What that means to a family who's faced with that sort of power. Do they fight against it? Oh, they're terrified. They're terrified because they've seen what's happened, right? And so are they likely to even have the resources to fight against it? And then also one of the other points is they're keenly aware they can come back and they will. So it's that front gate. That front gate absolutely has to be narrow. And its core, at its very core, it is about respecting families.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
Yes, Tim?
I have like two questions. My first one is, don't you want to come back to Illinois and help us do what we're doing? Because it's all of these things you're discussing. But aside from that, and I don't know if you have thought on it because it's fairly new, but the liability insurance issue for foster care homes in California, you all's insurance companies have pulled out, which are going to require all the kids and families to go back to the counties. And these private agencies that you spoke of will no longer be providing that care.
Can I just repeat the question?
Sure.
So in case you didn't hear in the back, there were two questions. One, can you come back to Illinois because we need you? And the second question was a question about insurance. So there's an issue going on in California, maybe in other states. There's a large insurance provider that insures foster family agencies, these nonprofit agencies, and it has given everyone notice that they're pulling out of the state because these lawsuits have become untenable, they say, and they can no longer manage the liability. And so there's a tug of war with the legislature to see if somebody's going to come and backfill. And everyone is expecting as the last resort that all of these families who are connected to foster family agencies will have to be absorbed by the counties. So what do you think of that, Andrew? And what are your thoughts about solving that problem?
This gets a little in the weeds, but I love the weeds. So, in the state of California, there are two types of foster homes. There are department homes and there are foster family agencies. And very quickly, very briefly, at a very broad, the reason why those two exist is originally foster family agencies were created to be responsible for higher level kids that had higher needs. Okay. So what happened, of course, is that we're simply not good at triaging children. And so I ran a foster family agency, and the children that we were given, the children that we were responsible for, were really no different than the children that DCFS, managed. I will also say that one of our greatest fears every year was denial of that insurance policy, because we knew if it was denied, we'd go out of existence. So what I say is the impact is foster family agencies in the state of California are generally, when someone asks me, I'd like to become a foster parent, first things I'll say is go with an FFA.
Absolutely.
Don't go with the department.
Go with
A foster family agency. Go now, not all. There's some foster family agencies I could go to, but go with a private agency. And the reason for that is they provide more immediate support for families and more immediate support for kids. If a placement begins to struggle, a foster family agency is more likely to be able to keep that placement intact. So the impact of this
will be to move, first of all, a movement, a very large movement of children into, for lack of a better word, bureaucratic foster homes. Children will be seen less, families will receive less support. And at the end of the day, what that will mean is children will be moved. Children will be moved more. Placements will not be supported. Right? So children will be moved. And dare I say, that means that more children will be placed in congregated care, in residential treatment facilities, the worst sort of places for kids. So it's time for the state to provide that insurance.
And you think that's the strategy or that's the answer for the state to provide that insurance to the private agencies?
So I don't know the ins and I don't know the ins and outs enough about private insurance. I never actually sat down, but there's this one, and for us, or the motivations behind it. But we do this all the time, right? Federal government, for gosh sakes, federal government, provides insurance for, penthouses in Florida. Right? It provides flood insurance all over the place. It insures things that are uninsurable by the market all the time. And so it can certainly do this. Okay. Can I add just one other thing about what this really involves? What this core involves, and again, involves money, right? It involves the concern for lawsuits. And the way this works is allegations against foster parents, right? The truth is, these are actually part of it. Do they ever really go anywhere? It's the liabilities. And the reason why the liability is a bit of a myth is that these placements, when an incident happens, they are overwhelmingly ruled unsubstantiated. And I talk about that in this. What a frustrating thing this is. And only in the child welfare would you have. So imagine if you had an elementary school and word got out that there were dozens of unsubstantiated reports of harm done to children at this elementary school. You would have reporters, you'd have the mayor, you'd have lawyers, you'd have the entire community descend on that elementary school. Group homes? Do you know how many unsubstantiated? Don't do that. It's acceptable. It's absolutely acceptable. But also what I would say is when it comes to practice, your practice as a social worker, what I'm really just, forgive me, but I'm not a social worker, but just a bit of advice. It's not about substantiated or unsubstantiated as a kid. But the real point is to sit down with that child in a trusting way, confidential way, and ask that child this one question. Do you feel safe? And the moment that child says no, that child needs to, that concern needs to be addressed in a meaningful way. That's the standard. It's not a lawyer standard. It's substantiated versus unsubstantiated. That's what you do. Yes.
I'm sure you're familiar with the Family First Act and also perhaps continuing Duerr reform in California, which resulted in a lot of group homes being shut down. Those that didn't shut down converted to a short-term residential facility. And there's lots of anecdotal reports, I'm sure many of them are true, of children now cycling in and out through many homes, hoteling, county child welfare offices. There's just like rampant instability. And so I'm curious, what do the children need? How do we get children who were formerly in an institution safe and stable in family-like settings? Because I think everybody's lost right now as some children with complexity in their mental health picture are just, we can't find the right place for them. And I don't think that their group homes or their STRTPs were the great places for them. And I don't even know that stability was something that we wanted for them, especially in light of your story. But I also want to stop the harm that comes from moving about and being rejected constantly and over and over?
I think it's a really important question, and what I would say is it's a bold question. And I don't mean that in any offensive way, but I would say before Families First, I was deputy of the Broad Foundation, right, after I went to the Alliance for Children's Rights. And we worked on the second waiver in the country to allow exactly what Families First does. The only other state that had it was, and it was remarkably similar to Families First. It was a block grant, which was a bit controversial, but we can talk about it ways. It was a lump sum. So what that meant was we gave up the traditional way in which foster care is funded. Everyone know how that is? How many kids you take in and how long you keep them? I can't think of a worse set of incentives. And so what it said is instead of this open-ended funding stream, we'll go ahead and we'll take a block. We have ways that would increase, ways that if it got control, right, that we'd be able to opt out, right? But what it allowed was for us to go ahead and take money from these facilities and to place them into kin care and into foster families. Here's the thing. Yeah, when I look at, we can go on to the, happy to go into the complexity of it. My core, what I think of when I think of this is when we look at that child who is now in a residential treatment facility in the state of Illinois, psych hospital, just stuck kid, up to those kids.
We're working on
Those
that
kids.
now.
What I think of is a comparison of trauma. And that's, I wish we could think of it. Is that child better off having been placed in that place, and put in that psych hospital for years, or isolated in that facility, or would that child have been better? Just, would that child have been better off if we just left them? If we had provided, for example, alternatives to taking that child? Because the truth of it is, the way these systems operate is children follow. If you have money to support families, you expand TANF, if you reduce restrictions on TANF, you reduce work requirements on TANF, studies that show entries into foster care to go. Put more restrictions on TANF across the state, let's go up. So, more money that goes to families, children will stay there. You put more money into detention, children will be detained. Within the system, you put more money to support foster families. And this, good gosh, we learn how to recruit foster families correctly and stop using billboards. It doesn't work that way, right? If you put more money into that, children will go into individual foster families or therapeutic foster families, which I worked on recruiting as well. If you put it to congregate care, children will go there. Children will follow money and will follow the easiest placement that's available. And that's what happens.
I think though, I'm sorry, you didn't answer the question, which is a relatively simple question about, right? If a child that's been institutionalized, right, in a congregate care situation for too long
Okay, I'll answer.
and hurt, and we want to move them into a family, how do we make that family
So,
the type of place?
So I'll answer. Let's take a good look at that child. Okay, this is a serious question. I'll be very serious about it. If we look at that child's record, right, and look at the way that child's record is developed over time, we'll see that that child's record has essentially become a rap sheet. That the child that is represented on that case file very often does not really match the child that we're looking at. All right, and this is about practice. And what we see over time is we see weaknesses, we see issues with the child, not only just be repeated, but grow. And we certainly see this on the sides of families. And so the first answer is a reevaluation of that child. Now I confronted this, for example, with MacLaren and Eufaula. How do you close two facilities like that? It's about case planning. It's hard. It's about going through child by child by child. Now, if I get what you're getting at, and I think I do, if you just flat out close a facility, oh, no. They did that with MacLaren. So let me,
I want to think about it from the foster parent's perspective. How do we equip them to support that?
well, let me finish. Okay. Because I want to make this clear. When they closed MacLaren,
They closed it in 3 months. And so it is, what I'm talking about is when I talk about case planning, that's not just a kid. Case planning is also a foster parent. They work together. You don't do case planning without thinking of what the outcome is. And the outcome, in this case, it sounds like, is a foster parent, right? So really, we're talking about the same, right? And so that's what's required, and that's what you have to do. Now, I'm not saying that you can immediately shut those facilities down, but you can certainly work toward it, right? And there are many, many alternatives, many reexaminations of these foster. So what happens, quite honestly, is when kids get that deep into the system, case planning actively stops. It really does. It calcifies, right? And so you find, for example, you have a 16-year-old who's been in foster care since they were 8. When they were 8 in that family, the family was at risk. Maybe that family was not a safe place for that child. You now have a 16-year-old. Why not sit and take a look at that family now and see, does that family still present that risk to that child? Can that child be reunified with that child, right? So I guess my point is that these are far more elastic things than we think they are. And they just require sitting and thinking about it. I'm not claiming that it's easy, but I'm claiming to go beyond these notions that particularly that what is written in a case file is right, it's been right from the beginning, and that's what we're going to stick with. Yes, not. Did I get closer?
That's all, right? No.
I finally got there. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
One last question and then we'll wrap.
I'm sorry. I do feel very passionate.
That's good. Most people feel passionately about all of these topics. Good. Dora,
Question on two.
okay? You want to read it out loud?
The foster care system has long been criticized for disproportionately affecting children of color. From your legal and personal experience, what do you believe are the most important reforms needed to address these racial disparities and improve outcomes for all children?
So just so everyone, I want to all to know that what a black child faces in this country. They're more likely to be investigated. They're more likely to be detained. They're less likely to be reunified. At every major point in a black child's life, in the system, they're out. It's more likely to be placed in groups, right? 1.5 times likely to be placed in congregate care. 30% of all children who are placed in congregate care in this country are black. Right? So what do you do with it? I think there are some concrete things to do, and then there are some things that I don't. One of the concrete things I'll go back to is respect the constitutional rights of every family in this country. And if you look at the facts, the majority of people, the majority of families face that violation of that core right that we all take for granted. The good people of Santa Monica take for granted. I take for granted. Poor people who do not have it respected in this system are Black families. And I would also add Indigenous families. Indigenous. The state of North Dakota. If you look at the state of North Dakota, South Dakota, the number of Indigenous children who are foster children, you're talking 60–70%. It's enormous. It's enormous, and in no way proportional to the number of Indigenous families in that community. And so, as a lawyer, what I can say is to enforce the constitutional rights of these families and require that there be a warrant that is issued by a judge to pull back the authority of foster care departments and frankly frontline workers to go into a family's home. that would make a big difference. So, and it's just, that's a small start.
Important starting point.
All right, I thank you all for being here. I thank you so very much for your wisdom